Imagine a world where every nation is shackled by invisible chains, trillions in debt that multiply like shadows at dusk. The U.S. alone teeters under $38 trillion, Japan at $9 trillion, and the globe, a staggering $315 trillion, dwarfing the entire economy threefold. But pause here, because this isn't just numbers on a screen. It's a riddle that unravels everything you thought you knew about money. If everyone's borrowing, who's really collecting? Follow the trail and it leads not to some shadowy cabal, but to a self-devouring loop. The world owes itself. And lurking behind this paradox, four visionaries, merchants and bankers who, over 3 centuries, forged a financial fortress designed to endure forever. This isn't wild speculation, it's etched in ledgers, charters, and crises. What they built ensures debt isn't a bug. It's the beating heart of the system. Governments borrow endlessly. Interest cascades upward, and every bailout fattens the architect's heirs. Buckle up as we peel back the layers of this global trap, starting from a war-torn kingdom in 1694, and trace how it ensnared us all. Picture England in the late 17th century, a powder keg of ambition and peril. King William III stares down a ferocious war with France, his coffers scraped bare. Taxes trickle in too slowly, and the old guard of lenders, wealthy nobles and merchants, shake their heads. Why risk it? England had defaulted before, leaving fortunes in ruins. Defaults were the norm back then. Kings pledged repayment with a wink and a rate, but if the crown crumbled, so did the deal. It was chaotic, personal, finite. Debts died with dishonor or were settled in coin. No endless echoes. Enter William Paterson, a restless Scottish trader with a nose for opportunity and a trail of failed ventures behind him. He'd hustled across continents, from the Caribbean to the Baltic, chasing wealth that always slipped away. But in 1691, amid the fog of war, Paterson saw a chink in the armor of monarchy. He didn't approach the king with gold or promises of quick victory. No, Paterson pitched a machine, a perpetual engine of finance. Gather a syndicate of London's richest merchants, he urged, to pool £1.2 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today, for the war chest. But twist the knife. This wouldn't be a loan to repay in full. The principal? Eternal, untouchable. Instead, the crown would cough up 8% interest year after year, drawn straight from the people's taxes. To orchestrate this dance, they'd birth a new beast, the Bank of England. It was audacious, almost treasonous. The merchants would deposit their gold into this bank. The bank would funnel it to the treasury. The government would service the interest from parliamentary coffers. And the bank? It would distribute those payments back to the lenders like clockwork. Why bite on such a deal? Security, pure and simple. Parliament backed it with the full might of taxation. No more royal whims. As long as England drew breath and levied duties, the stream wouldn't dry. Plus, in exchange for their gold, lenders got banknotes, slips of paper as trusty as specie, but with a kicker. They accrued interest and traded freely on the bustling exchanges. Paterson's stroke of genius? The bank could issue these notes up to the loan's value, alchemizing government promises into circulating money. Debt birthed currency. In 1694, Parliament greenlit it. The Bank of England rose from the ashes of wartime desperation, and with it, national debt shed its temporary skin. It became immortal, a cornerstone, not a crisis. This wasn't just funding, it was reinvention. Governments could now borrow vast sums without the dread of repayment deadlines, fueling wars, empires, and infrastructure. But for the everyday soul grinding under higher taxes, it was a slow bleed. That 8% on 1.2 million, nearly £100,000 annually. forever. Merchants turned sovereign risk into a golden annuity, sellable to the next eager holder. Patterson had cracked the code: make debt the foundation of money itself. Europe watched, envious. Within decades, France spun up its own version with the Banque Générale. The Dutch refined their already shrewd systems, and by the dawn of the 19th century, a fledgling America drank deep from the well. Alexander Hamilton, that sharp-eyed architect of the young republic, mirrored the Bank of England beat for beat: permanent bonds, tax-backed interest, debt as the lifeblood of liquidity. The trap was set. But it needed teeth, and those came from a family that turned banking into an art of shadows and speculation. Fast forward to the Napoleonic Wars, a maelstrom that redrew maps and minted fortunes. Europe bled, and amid the chaos, one name whispered through the salons of Vienna and the counting houses of London: Nathan Rothschild. Born in 1777 to a modest Frankfurt clan of moneylenders, Nathan was the boldest of 5 brothers dispatched to England to weave their web across continents. He wasn't content with mere loans. He hungered for control. Picture 1815. Waterloo's fields run red, Wellington's forces clash with Napoleon's legions, and rumors fly like cannon shot. Nathan, perched in his London lair, didn't just fund the British war effort. He orchestrated the information flow that decided empires. The legend endures, but the facts are sharper. Rothschild's couriers, faster than any post, brought word of victory before the government's own dispatches. Stock soared on the exchange as he bought low on the panic, selling high on the triumph. But his true masterstroke? Revolutionizing how governments funded endless conflict. Drawing on Patterson's blueprint, Nathan pioneered the international bond market. He didn't just lend to Britain, he syndicated debt across borders, turning national I owe us into tradable securities snapped up by investors from Amsterdam to Vienna. When Britain needed millions to crush Napoleon, Rothschild floated loans backed not just by taxes, but by the spoils of victory: seizures, colonies, trade routes. Interest flowed, principles sat untouched, and the bonds? They became the glue of global finance, circulating like blood in veins. What elevated Rothschild was scale and secrecy. He built a network where family branches in Paris, Berlin, and beyond synchronized loans, hedging risks, and arbitraging currencies. Governments borrowed from this invisible syndicate, paying premiums in perpetuity. And in crises, Rothschild was the lifeline and the profiteer. The Congress of Vienna, that grand redraw of Europe post-Napoleon, was bankrolled by his bonds. Debt didn't just fund wars, it reshaped the world order. By the 1820s, nations from Brazil to the Ottomans tapped Rothschild financing, locking them into cycles of borrowing where interest outpaced growth. The genius? Debt as diplomacy. Default, and you'd face not just financial ruin, but isolation from the markets. Nathan's innovation layered atop Patterson's. Now, debt wasn't just permanent, it was global, interconnected, a web where one thread's tug rippled everywhere. Taxpayers footed the bill, but the flow enriched a new elite. Yet even this empire of bonds had limits, exposed in the panics that scorched the Gilded Age. The 19th century's end brought industrialization's roar and its tremors. Railroads spiderwebbed continents, factories belched smoke, but beneath the boom lurked fragility. Banks multiplied like weeds, issuing notes willy-nilly, fueling speculation until crashes toppled them like dominoes. Enter J.P. Morgan, the titan of Wall Street, a bearded colossus whose word could steady or shatter markets. Born John Pierpont in 1837 to a banking dynasty, Morgan wasn't born poor. but he forged himself into a force of nature. By the 1890s, he commanded trusts that swallowed industries from steel to electricity. But it was the financial infernos that revealed his vision and his grip on the debt machine. Recall the panic of 1893. Railroads overextended, banks drained dry, unemployment exploding. Morgan didn't wait for pleas. He orchestrated bailouts, pooling gold from Europe to prop up the U.S. Treasury. No fanfare, just results. Then came 1907, the big one. A stock plunge igniting a run on banks, New York teetering on the brink. The Federal Reserve didn't exist yet. The system was a patchwork of private lenders. Morgan locked financiers in his library, brokered loans from his own vault, and thawed the freeze. He saved the day, but at what cost? Governments were mere bystanders while private bankers like him held the keys. This wasn't charity. It crystallized a truth. The debt pyramid needed a guardian. Morgan's influence birthed the Federal Reserve in 1913, a central bank modeled on his interventions, but centralized, perpetual. No more chaotic privates. Now the Fed would issue currency against government debt, just as Patterson's bank did centuries prior. Bonds became the collateral for money supply, interest payments the eternal drip. Morgan layered security on Rothschild's global web. Bailouts weren't ad hoc, they were institutionalized, ensuring the system self-perpetuated. Crises didn't end debt. They amplified it, with taxpayers absorbing the shocks via inflated money and higher levies. The U.S., once wary of central banks, now leaned in, its debt swelling to fund world wars and welfare states. But even this vault had cracks, widening in the fires of inflation that scorched the 20th century's close. By the 1970s, the beast Patterson unleashed had mutated. Post-Bretton Woods, gold ties severed in 1971, money was pure fiat, debt dollars from thin air. Oil shocks and war spending ignited hyperinflation, eroding savings, punishing the wage earner. Enter Paul Volcker, the stern Fed chair appointed in 1979, a lanky economist with a pipe and a poker face. He wasn't a merchant like Patterson or a speculator like Rothschild and Morgan. He was the enforcer, wielding the tools they'd built. Volcker's war on inflation was brutal. Prime rates spiked to 20%, recessions bit deep, unemployment soared. Why? To break the cycle, where endless debt-fueled printing devalued everything. But here's the suspenseful turn. Volcker's cure didn't dismantle the trap, it fortified it. By taming inflation, he restored faith in the system, allowing debt to balloon unchecked. Governments borrowed for deficits, corporations for buybacks, citizens for homes and cars. The Fed, in Volcker's mold, became the ultimate lender of last resort, quantitative easing its modern sorcery, printing trillions against bonds that never retire. Today, that $38 trillion U.S. debt, it's not a cliff, it's the fuel. Interest payments alone devour budgets, flowing to bondholders, pension funds, foreign states, but ultimately the bankers' descendants in hedge funds and central vaults. So why does this matter now as markets jitter and recessions loom? Because the trap is tightening. Geopolitical storms, trade wars, pandemics demand more borrowing, yet growth stalls under the weight. Central banks print, but inequality festers. The top 1% hoards the interest, while the base pays via squeezed wages and austerity. We've globalized Patterson's annuity into a $315 trillion colossus, Rothschild's bonds into derivatives towers, Morgan's bailouts into endless stimulus, Volcker's discipline into fiat infinity. It's resilient, yes, but fragile. A spark, a default cascade, a dollar wobble, and the self-owing world could fracture. Reflect on this. Four men, separated by eras, wove a tapestry where debt isn't failure, but design. It funded progress, toppled tyrants, lifted billions, yet it extracts a toll, the eternal upward siphon. As you watch your taxes vanish into the ether, remember, the system works precisely as intended. The question isn't how to escape, it's whether we even want to. The debt trap endures, and so do we, trapped within it. Imagine this. A shadowy mechanism forged in the fog of 17th century London that turned national ambition into an endless chain of debt. Governments borrow, they promise to repay, but the noose tightens. Interest payments funded by fresh loans, rolling over obligations that never truly end. What if I told you this isn't some modern conspiracy, but a system born in 1694, perfected by cunning bankers and now binding the world's superpowers? Welcome to the hidden architecture of eternal debt, where kings and presidents alike walk blindly into the same trap. Buckle up, because as we unravel this thread, you'll see why your taxes, your savings, and the global economy are all tangled in its web. Let's step back to the dawn of this beast. William Paterson, that Scottish merchant we glimpsed earlier, didn't just help birth the Bank of England, he unleashed a financial Frankenstein. By 1719, when he slipped away from this world, Paterson wasn't swimming in riches. But his creation, it outlived him, morphed, and multiplied. Fast forward 3 centuries, and the Bank of England still stands sentinel over the city. British government debt? It's a mountain that has never crumbled. No full repayment, no clean slate, just refinancings, rollovers, and relentless expansion. From the War of the Spanish Succession to today's budget battles, every administration since has stepped willingly into Paterson's snare. It's as if the ink on those original bonds carried a curse. Borrow once, owe forever. By the turn of the 19th century, this debt alchemy had spread like wildfire across Europe. Monarchs and parliaments hungry for power turned to borrowing not just for glory on the battlefield, but for roads, canals, and the grinding machinery of empires. Wars devoured gold. Infrastructure promised progress. Yet the system was a chaotic bazaar. No grand exchange, no standardized trades. Loans were hammered out in smoke-filled rooms, one sovereign deal at a time. Interest rates swung like pendulums, from usurious highs to desperate lows. And who could play? Only the elite, the merchant princes with vaults full of coin. It was inefficient, risky, and ripe for revolution. Enter the Rothschilds, a family that didn't just join the game, they rewrote the rules, turning sovereign debt into an industrial powerhouse. Picture this. In the gritty alleys of Frankfurt, a humble money changer named Meyer Amschel Rothschild raises 5 sons, each destined to conquer a corner of Europe. By 1800, they've planted banking flags in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This wasn't a loose alliance, it was a financial nervous system, pulsing with information and capital faster than any rival. Couriers on horseback, coded letters, private ships, they moved money across borders while governments fumbled with slow dispatches. Suddenly, borrowing for a crown meant dealing with a web that spanned the continent. At the heart of it all was Nathan Rothschild in London, the sharp-eyed strategist who saw debt not as a burden but as a machine to be engineered. During the Napoleonic Wars, as cannon fire echoed from the fields of Europe, Nathan became Britain's lifeline. He funneled loans to fund Wellington's armies, but his true stroke of genius lay in the mechanics. Forget direct handouts to the Treasury. Too slow, too vulnerable. Nathan scooped up government bonds at steep discounts, straight from the issuance table. Then, like a master auctioneer, he flipped them to a hungry crowd. Pension funds salivating for steady yields, insurance giants hedging risks, and fat cat investors chasing the next big score. the government got its war chest overnight. Nathan pocketed the spread, the delicious margin between buy and sell. And the buyers? They held liquid assets, bonds that could be traded, collateralized, passed hand to hand. But here's where the shadows deepen and the suspense builds. Nathan didn't stop at facilitation. He orchestrated dependency. In 1815, as Napoleon's empire teetered on the brink, the Battle of Waterloo unfolded in a storm of mud and musket smoke. Nathan's private network, those swift riders and encrypted signals, beat the official messengers to London by hours. Napoleon defeated, Britain victorious. Yet Nathan played it like a high-stakes poker bluff. He flooded the market with sales of British consols, those government bonds, whispering doom through his brokers. Prices plummeted. Panic rippled through the exchanges. Traders dumped holdings in a frenzy. Then, at the nadir, with bonds dirt cheap, Nathan swept in, buying en masse. Dawn broke with the truth. Victory. Prices rocketed. Nathan's fortune swelled by millions, not from crude theft, as we'd label it now, but from wielding information like a weapon, timing the chaos to his rhythm. This Waterloo wager wasn't a one-off. It crystallized the Rothschild doctrine: command the flow of knowledge, dictate the birth of debt, and own the marketplace. By 1820, if a king or chancellor needed funds, be it for a crusade or a railway, they knocked on the Rothschild door. Why? The brothers didn't just lend, they distributed. Their investor web spanned borders, a constellation of loyal buyers ready to snap up new issues. Terms set by the House of Rothschild. Rates stabilized, volumes exploded, and sovereign debt went from bespoke craft to mass production. Now, let's escalate. Why did this transform Patterson's trap from sticky to suffocating? Pre-Rothschild, a default was a king's gambit. Stiff and angry lender, lose some trade privileges, maybe spark a skirmish, but reset the board. Creditors were local, traceable, finite. Nathan shattered that. He made bonds nomadic, slicing them into shares traded from London to Lisbon. A British consul might start in a Westminster vault, end up in a Parisian salon, get pledged to a Berlin lender, and underpin a Viennese estate. Ownership tangled into a Gordian knot. Default? It wasn't slapping one wrist anymore. It was yanking a thread that could unravel alliances, topple banks, ignite panics across seas. Governments, once sovereign predators, became prey in their own game. Refusal to pay meant not honor, but apocalypse, systemic meltdown, so they paid. And to pay the interest, they borrowed more. The trap, once permanent, turned inescapable. A vortex where old debts birthed new ones, interest compounding like interest on interest. The Rothschilds rode this wave to unimaginable heights. Mid-19th century, they eclipsed monarchs in wealth. No factories, no fleets, just the quiet drip of interest from government ledgers. They financed railways that knit Europe, but their gold flowed from the endless stream of sovereign I owe us. Patterson's 1694 spark had ignited a bonfire, and by 1815 the flames consumed the continent. Every throne, every parliament snared in the blaze. As the 20th century dawned, the inferno leaped the Atlantic. America, that booming colossus of steel and steam, chugged forward on raw economic muscle. Yet its financial veins were archaic. Banks as isolated fiefdoms, currency shackled to gold reserves, no grand conductor for the dead orchestra. Panics flared like wildfires, unchecked and brutal. Then came 1907, a year that tested the Republic's spine. Wall Street convulsed. Stocks vaporized in days. Runs on banks drained vaults dry. Credit froze like Arctic ice. Factories idled. Bread lines snaked through cities. Into this abyss stepped J.P. Morgan, the Titan of Titans, not as a selfless savior, but as the guardian of his own realm. At 70, with a beard like Moses and a will of iron, Morgan summoned the city's banking barons to his opulent library on Madison Avenue. Doors bolted, escape denied. He browbeat them into pooling fortunes, tens of millions in personal pledges to prop up the teetering giants. For days they toiled under his gaze, wiring funds, auditing ledgers. The panic ebbed. Markets steadied. Morgan emerged as America's shadow central banker, the man who single-handedly stanched the bleed. But age whispered warnings. Morgan knew he couldn't play hero forever. In the panic's ashes, he and his inner circle, the robber barons of finance, plotted a fortress. America needed a perpetual stabilizer, a central authority to orchestrate money, manage debt, prevent the next inferno. Yet the public? They recoiled. Memories of the Bank of the United States, that monster Andrew Jackson had slain decades prior, still burned. Central banks smacked of aristocracy, foreign meddling, elite control. To push this through, it would take shadows and subtlety, a campaign veiled in reformist rhetoric. Cut to today, and the echoes thunder. That 1907 drama birthed the Federal Reserve in 1913, America's own debt engine, modeled on the Bank of England, industrialized by Rothschild cunning and now dwarfing them all. Global debt, over $300 trillion, a Gordian knot binding nations, corporations, even you and me. Why does this matter now in an era of skyrocketing deficits, crypto upheavals, and whispers of inflation wars? Because the trap Patterson set, Rothschild wove, and Morgan fortified isn't history. It's the air we breathe financially. Governments borrow to survive, central banks print to sustain, and interest accrues like an unrelenting tide. One wrong move, a default in Athens, a yield spike in Washington, and the interconnections could cascade into crisis. We're not spectators, we're invested. So next time you hear of trillion-dollar packages or bond auctions, remember, it's the same game, 331 years running. Will we ever escape? Or is eternal debt the price of modern power? The ledger's open, your move. Imagine this, a shadowy gathering on a fog-shrouded island off the Georgia coast, where America's most influential tycoons plot in secrecy to reshape the nation's money supply. What if I told you this clandestine meeting in 1910 didn't just birth a banking system, it unlocked the door to endless government debt, a trap that's now ballooned to $38 trillion and counting. The stakes were sky high. Expose the plan, and riots could erupt. Keep it hidden, and the bankers seize control forever. This is the untold story of how the Federal Reserve was forged in deception, turning fleeting crises into a perpetual cycle of borrowing that binds us all. We pick up in the wake of the 1907 panic, where J.P. Morgan had single-handedly stabilized the U.S. economy, stepping in as the unofficial guardian of America's finances. But at 70, he couldn't play hero indefinitely. The fractures in the system were too deep. Bank runs, liquidity droughts, wild speculation. Morgan and his inner circle, the titans of Wall Street, knew they needed something unbreakable, a central authority to manage money and prevent chaos. Yet the ghosts of history loomed large. The first and second banks of the United States had been slain by waves of populist fury, branded as tools of elite control that drained the common man. No, a straight-up central bank would never fly. It had to be cloaked in the language of democracy, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Enter the veil of secrecy. In November 1910, under the cover of a duck hunting excursion, Morgan's allies, including Senator Nelson Aldrich, a political heavyweight with deep banking ties and envoys from the nation's largest financial houses, convened on Jekyll Island. For 9 tense days, they holed up in a secluded club far from prying eyes. Leaks could spell disaster. The public already seethed against money trusts dominating the economy. Whispers of their true purpose, crafting the blueprint for a national monetary overhaul, would ignite outrage. Picture the scene. Flickering lanterns on polished oak tables, heated debates echoing through empty halls as they dissected the power of currency. Aldrich, with his mustache twitching in the dim light, sketched frameworks that echoed the ingenuity of earlier architects like William Patterson and Nathan Rothschild, who centuries before had woven private interests into public finance. What emerged from those shadowed sessions was a masterpiece of misdirection. They wouldn't call it a central bank. That term reeked of tyranny. Instead, it would masquerade as the Federal Reserve System, a network of 12 regional banks scattered across the country, evoking images of balanced local control. No single Wall Street overlord pulling strings. Oversight would fall to a board of governors, handpicked by the president, sounding every bit like a government watchdog. Decentralized, democratic, for the people. But peel back the layers and the truth slithers into view. Those regional Fed banks, privately owned by the very member banks that fueled America's commerce, the same institutions Morgan commanded. These banks would nominate the regional boards, which in turn influenced the national board. Government appointees added a patina of legitimacy, but the levers of real power stayed firmly in banker hands. The crowning deception lay in the mechanics of money itself. The most potent authority, summoning currency into existence and snapping up government bonds, landed squarely with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the beating heart of Morgan's domain. Wall Street's giants, his banks included, would dictate the flow. It was a structure echoing the subtle dominions built by Patterson in founding the Bank of England or Rothschild's web across Europe, private profit masked as public service. By December 1913, the Federal Reserve Act sailed through Congress amid the holiday rush. Many lawmakers, dazzled by the jargon or distracted by politics, voted without grasping the full scope. It was a stealth revolution, and just like that, the debt floodgates creaked open. Before the Fed, government's borrowing had hard limits. Banks could only lend what they held in reserves, real money from deposits or gold. But now, the Fed could conjure dollars from thin air to purchase treasury bonds, creating an insatiable buyer for the government's "I owe us." Here's how the trap snaps shut. The Treasury floats a bond to fund wars, roads, or deficits. The Fed buys it, crediting the account with freshly minted money. No gold, no limits, just keystrokes. The government spends that cash into the economy, stimulating growth or plugging holes. The debt? It swells on the Fed's books, secured only by the faith that taxpayers will foot the bill eternally. Interest payments? They cascade back to the private banks holding Fed ownership stakes. It's a closed loop of creation and extraction where debt begets more debt, and the system hums on borrowed time. Fast forward and the implications spiral into a vortex. Morgan passed in 1913, the very year his vision crystallized, but his blueprint endures. Without the Fed's guaranteed demand, the U.S. couldn't sustain its $38 trillion debt mountain. Markets would balk, rates would soar, forcing austerity. Instead, the Fed rolls it over indefinitely, buying time with inflation or quantitative easing. This isn't just American theater, it's the global playbook. By the 1970s, the debt machine Patterson pioneered, Rothschild refined, and Morgan industrialized had metastasized worldwide. Developed nations borrowed voraciously, servicing endless loans with growth. But the developing world? They plunged into the abyss during the low-rate 1970s, funding dams, factories, dreams of progress, and dollars. Then came the reckoning. Enter Paul Volcker, Fed chairman from 1979 to 1987, a towering figure with a no-nonsense glare facing America's inflation nightmare. Double-digit price surges, over 13% at its peak, eroded savings, shattered trust in the dollar. Allies abroad dumped U.S. bonds. Credibility teetered. Volcker, channeling the iron will of past financial guardians, slammed the brakes. In a bold 1979 pivot, he jacked the federal funds rate from 11% to a staggering 20%, the highest ever. Factories shuttered, unemployment spiked to 10%, recession gripped the land. Inflation? Crushed, tamed to under 4% by 1983. Victory? But at what cost? The shock waves rippled far beyond U.S. shores, striking the most vulnerable. Latin America, Africa, Asia, nations that had gorged on cheap dollar loans now faced tripled interest burdens. Mexico's tab, $80 billion. Brazil's, $60 billion. Argentina's, $40 billion. Exports couldn't cover the bleed. Interest alone devoured revenues. In August 1982, Mexico blinked first, declaring it couldn't pay. Default loomed like a guillotine. U.S. banks, Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, had shoveled those billions out the door. A cascade of failures could topple the global order, echoing 1907 but on steroids. Wall Street held its breath. Panic clawed at the edges. Volcker faced a fork in the road. Let the defaults purge the system. Banks absorb losses, weak loans evaporate, markets reset. Harsh, but purifying. Or intervene, propping up the edifice at any price. He chose the latter, not out of altruism, but to safeguard the interlocking web of finance. Through the International Monetary Fund, a bailout symphony unfolded. Fresh loans poured in for Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and beyond, not to rebuild, but to service the old debts, keep the interest flowing to American lenders. These weren't gifts. They were chains called, quote, two. The price? Savagery. Slash social spending. Schools, hospitals gutted. Privatize crown jewels, oil fields, utilities auctioned to foreign bidders. Fling doors wide to imports, devalue currencies to scraps. Sovereignty surrendered on the altar of repayment. And the cruel twist, these IMF infusions didn't erase a dime of principle. Debt levels soared higher, trapping nations in a vice. Exports funneled straight to creditors. Growth stifled. Inequality festered. What began as infrastructure hope curdled into perpetual servitude. Volcker's cure for inflation didn't just scar America, it globalized the debt trap, ensuring the system Morgan designed wouldn't fracture. Banks thrived, governments bent, and the cycle spun on. Why does this echo today with urgency sharper than ever? That $38 trillion U.S. debt isn't isolated. It's the tip of a $300 trillion global iceberg. Central banks worldwide mimic the Fed's playbook, printing to buy bonds, bailing out the indebted. Crises like 2008 or COVID, more fuel for the machine. Without these guardians, markets would enforce discipline, curbing excesses, but with them, debt knows no bounds, inflation lurks as a silent tax, and everyday folk shoulder the load through eroded wages and squeezed budgets. The hidden warning? This structure, born in secrecy on Jekyll Island, prioritizes banker survival over national resilience. One spark, a rate hike too far, a default chain reaction, and the infinite debt illusion could shatter, dragging us into abyss. Reflect on this. From Patterson's bold strokes in 1694 England to Rothschild's continental maneuvers, Morgan's American fortress and Volcker's global lockdown, we've built a financial colossus that devours limits. It's ingenious, insidious, and inescapable until we choose to confront it. The question isn't if the trap will spring, but when. And when it does, will we be ready to rewrite the script? Imagine a world where nations are shackled not by chains, but by numbers on a ledger, so trillions in debt that never dies, sucking the lifeblood from economies like a hidden vampire in the night. What if I told you that the global financial system isn't broken? It's built this way on purpose. A machine designed to keep the powerful in power, rolling over crises century after century, ensuring that escape is not just difficult, it's impossible. Buckle up, because we're diving into the shadowy architecture of infinite debt, and by the end, you'll see why your paycheck, your retirement, and your country's future are all caught in its web. Let's pull back the curtain on the raw reality we've just uncovered. Those IMF bailouts, they weren't lifelines. They were lifelines laced with poison. Instead of slashing the noose of debt-strangling struggling economies, they simply lengthened it, turning temporary desperation into an eternal grind. Picture this: a country on the brink, lights flickering in government offices, factories idling, citizens marching in the streets. The IMF swoops in with fresh loans, but not to wipe the slate clean. No, the goal is surgical precision. Keep the interest payments ticking like a doomsday clock, while carving out concessions that strip away control. It's a devil's bargain. Privatize your crown jewels, slash social safety nets, fling open your borders to foreign speculators, and watch your currency plummet to make exports cheaper for outsiders. Sovereignty. That's the first casualty, traded for the illusion of stability. But who engineered this ruthless playbook? Enter Paul Volcker, the iron-fisted Fed chair whose shadow looms large even after his passing in 2019. He didn't invent debt, but he perfected its trap. When nations teetered on default, Volcker's era at the IMF and beyond whispered the same mantra. Forgiveness is for fools. Restructure, refinance, reload. Lend just enough to service the old loans, then demand reforms that bind the borrower tighter to the creditor's will. It's control disguised as compassion, a geopolitical chess move where checkmate means perpetual payments. We've seen this script play out like a grim rerun. Argentina's collapse in 2001, riots tearing through Buenos Aires as austerity bit deep. Greece in 2010, the cradle of democracy reduced to begging at Europe's table, selling off islands and ports while pensions evaporated. Sri Lanka in 2022, fuel shortages sparking fury as the island nation auctioned its soul to stay afloat. Each time, the IMF's formula repeats: inject cash to pay interest, impose belt tightening that crushes the middle class, erode national autonomy, and voila, the debt lingers, rebranded but unkillable. Why does this matter right now, as inflation whispers turn to roars and recessions lurk around the corner? Because Volcker's legacy isn't ancient history. It's the operating system of today's $315 trillion global debt bomb. Governments, corporations, households, all drowning in borrowed time, interconnected in a fragile lattice where one crack could shatter the whole. Default isn't an option, it's forbidden. Refinancing keeps the engine humming, but at what cost? Interest payments alone siphon off trillions annually, funneled from taxpayers to the vaults of banks and funds, widening the chasm between the haves and have-nots. In an era of climate crises, pandemics, and geopolitical storms, this trap ensures the vulnerable pay the price while the architect's heirs feast. To understand the full horror, we have to trace the blueprints back through time to the four visionaries who layered this fortress brick by insidious brick. It starts in 1694 with William Paterson, that shrewd Scottish merchant whose brainchild was the Bank of England. He didn't just lend to the crown, he created a model of eternal servitude. Governments borrow vast sums for wars or whims, but repayment? Forget it. They service the interest indefinitely, the principal ballooning like a shadow in the dark. Patterson's genius, or curse, was making monarchy meet market, turning sovereign desperation into a steady revenue stream for lenders. No principal payback meant no end game, just endless interest, a river of gold flowing from public coffers to private pockets. Fast forward to the early 1800s, and Nathan Rothschild steps into the spotlight, the legendary banker whose family empire spanned continents. He took Patterson's static debt and set it free, or rather, unleashed it. Bonds became tradable commodities, sliced and diced on global exchanges from London to New York. Suddenly, it's not one lender breathing down your neck. It's a syndicate, a web of investors from every corner of the world. Default on that? You'd unravel the entire tapestry. Markets crash, pensions vaporize, economies seize. Rothschild's innovation globalized the grip, making debt a shared addiction. One nation's folly becomes everyone's risk, binding the world in mutual assured financial destruction. Enter the 20th century, and J.P. Morgan emerges as the titan who industrialized this beast. The legendary financier, with his monopoly on American steel and rails, saw the power vacuum after panics like 1907. His fix? Central banks as the ultimate sugar daddy. The Federal Reserve, born from his influence, steps in to print money and snap up government bonds, creating artificial demand that lets Uncle Sam borrow without end. It's alchemy. Fiat currency floods the system, propping up deficits with zero real limits. Governments issue debt, central banks buy it with freshly minted cash, and the cycle spins faster. More borrowing, more bonds, more money chasing the illusion of growth. Morgan ensured the supply was infinite, turning national treasuries into bottomless wells. Now, weave in Volcker's trap from the late 20th century, and the picture snaps into focus. When the bill comes due and payments falter, whether for a superpower or a struggling state, don't erase the slate. Restructure it into a labyrinth of conditions, keeping the interest artery open while extracting every ounce of leverage. The result? A global debt colossus, $315 trillion strong, spanning every sector. Government I owe us pile up alongside corporate leverage and family mortgages, all linked in a daisy chain of dependency. Pull one thread, say, a default in the emerging markets, and the ripple hits Wall Street, Tokyo, and your local bank. Let's zoom in on the mechanics because the devil's in the details and they're more chilling than you think. Take the United States, ground zero of this empire. $38 trillion in federal debt, a number that keeps climbing like a thriller's plot twist. Who holds the reins? Roughly $20 trillion sits with domestic players, the American public, funneled through pension funds, mutual funds, insurers, banks, and the Fed itself. These treasury bonds are the gold standard of safety, luring buyers with promises of steady yields. But peel back the layers. That generates about $1 trillion in annual interest, courtesy of your tax dollars. The IRS collects from workers nationwide. Washington redistributes to bondholders, mostly elite institutions and the ultra-wealthy who own the lion's share. It's a silent heist, year after year, shifting wealth from labor to capital without a shot fired. Then there's the other $18 trillion, an intra-family loan that's pure sleight of hand. The government dipped into Social Security and Medicare trust funds, spending the loot on everything from highways to handouts. Now it owes itself, but redemption means hiking taxes or issuing more debt when retirees cash in. Taxpayers foot the bill either way, caught in a Ponzi-like loop where interest accrues regardless. Scale this up worldwide and the pattern repeats with eerie precision. Japan's $9 trillion tab is mostly held by its own banks and the Bank of Japan, a closed circuit of yen-fueled borrowing. Europe's $14 trillion burden weighs on ECB-backed institutions, while China's state-owned lenders juggle massive internal debts. It's a global round-robin. Japan owns U.S. treasuries. America backs European bonds via the IMF. The EU funnels funds to developing worlds through the World Bank. Everyone's on the hook for everyone else, interest cascading upward to the debt overlords. But here's the gut punch: why this house of cards can never topple. If the U.S. dared to pay down its $38 trillion, the fallout would be apocalyptic. Dollars enter circulation through borrowing, repay the debt, and poof, they vanish. Money supply contracts, prices plummet in deflationary freefall, credit freezes, and depression engulfs the globe. It's not mismanagement, it's math. The same holds internationally. Liquidate all sovereign debt, and the world's money pool shrinks by 2/3. Trade halts, businesses shutter, chaos reigns. Debt isn't a bug, it's the feature, the lifeblood of modern money. Designed to endure, it demands constant refinancing, a treadmill where stopping means falling off a cliff. And who reaps the whirlwind? The gatekeepers of this empire, asset behemoths like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity. These titans manage tens of trillions on behalf of the masses. Your 401k, grandma's IRA, corporate insurance pools. They deploy that capital into bonds worldwide, harvesting interest streams worth trillions. From U.S. Treasuries alone, it's $1 trillion yearly, plus slices from Japan, Europe, and beyond. A perpetual dividend funneled from the public purse to boardrooms. It's the greatest redistribution scheme ever devised, masked as debt service rather than the tax it truly is. Workers toil, institutions thrive, and the principle? It swells, ensuring the game never ends. These four, Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, Volcker, didn't huddle in a smoky room plotting across centuries. They operated in isolation, each tackling a crisis of their time. Yet their solutions aligned like stars in a banker-friendly constellation, each innovation fortifying the fortress. Patterson birthed the endless interest model. Rothschild wove the global net. Morgan unleashed unlimited liquidity. Volcker sealed the escape-proof door. Together, they've crafted a system where debt is the new normal, infinite and indispensable. As we stand on this precipice with debt clocks ticking louder than ever, the question burns: is this sustainable, or are we hurtling toward a reckoning? The architects are gone, but their machine hums on, extracting tribute from nations and individuals alike. The warning is clear. Awareness is the first step to resistance. Will we continue feeding the beast or demand a rewrite of the rules? The choice is ours, but time, like interest, is compounding. Stay vigilant. The system's secrets are out. Imagine this: a shadowy network of debt stretching across centuries, engineered not by accident, but by design. What if the $38 trillion U.S. national debt isn't a ticking time bomb, but the very engine powering the world's wealthiest institutions? Buckle up, because today we're peeling back the layers of history to reveal how four visionary and ruthless figures locked humanity into an endless cycle of borrowing. This isn't just finance, it's a heist in slow motion, and you're paying the tab. Let's rewind to the fog-shrouded streets of late 17th century London where the ashes of the Great Fire still lingered in the air. Our story begins with William Paterson, a Scottish merchant with a gambler's instinct and a merchant's cunning. In 1694, England was bleeding money from endless wars, its coffers empty after clashes with France. Paterson steps in with a radical pitch: create a national bank, funded by ordinary citizens subscribing to shares, lending that cash to the government at interest. The Bank of England is born, and with it, the concept of permanent public debt. No more one-off loans that get paid off. This was debt as a fixture, a perpetual machine churning interest payments from taxpayers to bondholders. Paterson didn't invent borrowing, but he made it immortal, laying the cornerstone for a system where governments never quite escape their "I owe us." Fast forward a century, to the thunder of Napoleonic cannons echoing across Europe. Enter Nathan Rothschild, the sharp-eyed banker whose family empire was rising from the Frankfurt ghettos. It's 1815 and the Battle of Waterloo hangs in the balance. Rothschild, with his unparalleled network of couriers, gets word of Napoleon's defeat days before the British government. He plays the markets like a maestro, spreading rumors of loss to crash stocks, then buying low before the truth breaks. But this isn't just opportunism. It's the birth of global finance. Rothschild's bonds fund Britain's war machine, traded across continents, turning national debt into an international commodity. He transforms Paterson's local engine into a worldwide web, where wars in Europe ripple to markets in America and Asia. Suddenly, debt isn't confined to one nation's borders. It's a global trade, with Rothschild's firm at the nexus, collecting interest from kings and commoners alike. Now the plot thickens as we hit the roaring chaos of the early 20th century. The U.S. is flexing its industrial might, but Wall Street's wildcat banks are a powder keg. Step forward J.P. Morgan, the titan with a mustache as imposing as his influence. In 1913, amid the panic of failing banks and a nation on the brink, Morgan brokers the creation of the Federal Reserve. Officially, it's to stabilize the economy, but dig deeper. This central bank allows the U.S. government to issue debt without limit, backed by the full faith of a growing superpower. Morgan's innovation, infinite scalability, no hard caps on borrowing, print money, issue bonds, roll over debts indefinitely. The Fed buys its own government's paper, inflating the money supply to service old loans with new ones. What started as Paterson's permanence and Rothschild's globalization now becomes boundless, a hydra-headed beast where every severed debt spawns two more. But the real clincher comes in the inflationary inferno of the 1970s, when oil shocks and loose money sent prices spiraling. Paul Volcker, the steely Fed chair with a no-nonsense glare, takes the helm in 1979 and unleashes a shock. Sky-high interest rates, crushing inflation but igniting a debt explosion. By 1982, as Reagan's deficits balloon, Volcker's policies cement the trap. High rates make borrowing addictive. Governments must issue more bonds just to pay the interest on old ones, creating a feedback loop of escalating debt. Volcker's era isn't about escape, it's about inevitability. He builds on his predecessors, making debt not just permanent, global, and infinite, but inescapable. Walk away? Impossible. The system's hooks are in too deep. Picture it unfolding like a thriller. These four men, separated by time, Paterson in his tricorn hat, Rothschild in his tailcoats, Morgan in his three-piece suits, Volcker at the Fed's polished desk, never met, yet their legacies interlock like gears in a vast machine. They didn't plot in smoky rooms, history handed them crises, and they engineered solutions that funneled wealth upward. Governments borrow eternally, Taxpayers foot the interest bill and financial titans reap the rewards. Not elected officials, not the public, the banks, the funds, the bond traders. They hold the strings. And here's where it gets chilling. That $38 trillion U.S. debt mountain, to the architect's heirs, it's no apocalypse. It's gold. Every dollar owed is an asset on a balance sheet, generating yield, securing loans, fueling derivatives worth quadrillions. Interest payments alone top $1 trillion a year, a river of cash flowing from your paycheck to their vaults. As long as faith endures, as long as we believe Uncle Sam will cough up the coupons even if the principal gathers dust forever, the carousel spins. Confidence is the lubricant, doubt is the wrecking ball. We've seen cracks, 2008's meltdown, Europe's sovereign scares, but the system bends, never breaks. Why? Because escaping means default, and default unravels everything. Pensions vaporize, markets freeze, global trade halts. Why does this matter right now in 2023? Because the debt clock is accelerating. Post-pandemic spending, geopolitical tensions, climate imperatives, governments are borrowing like never before. The U.S. alone adds trillions annually, while nations from Japan to Argentina teeter on the edge. We're not in a bubble, we're in the boiler room of the machine. If rates spike or trust erodes, say, from endless political gridlock or a black swan event, the interest burden could devour budgets, forcing austerity or inflation that hits the vulnerable hardest. This isn't abstract. It's your retirement, your mortgage rates, the groceries in your cart. The four architects designed a world where debt funds progress, wars won, infrastructure built, innovation sparked. But at what cost? When the bill comes due, it's the little guy who pays, while the bond kings collect. So as the credits roll on this financial odyssey, reflect on this. 3 centuries, 4 masterminds, 1 unbreakable chain. We're all inmates in their debtor's prison, paying rent on the very system that sustains us. If this revelation has flipped your view of that $38 trillion, from blunder to blueprint, then you've glimpsed the true levers of power. They won't cover this in civics class, where debt's painted as a solvable puzzle. No, the real lesson from Patterson to Volcker. Debt isn't the enemy. It's the empire. Interest is the toll we pay to keep the lights on in their kingdom. If you're hooked on unraveling these hidden histories, the who, the how, the why behind the markets that move us all, hit subscribe. Next time, we dive deeper into the machine's operators, the modern heirs pulling the strings. Because knowledge isn't just power. In this game, it's survival. Stay vigilant. The debt trap closes tighter every day.